that there is. President, Secretary, VP, Treasurer, and she's very civic-minded throughout the county. Her
Conservation?
thank you, I wanted
Yes.
to come out conversation. Conservation shirt is on tonight. She's gonna give us the history of the Kear family, who more or less got Minersville put together. I present to you Dr. Irvil.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm going to start off by saying I don't know who these people are. The pictures were in the house, and I'm assuming that they may be the people who built the house at 418 Front Street. So I'm calling them Elizabeth Gregg and William Kear. Now, but we need to go back one. When the Kears came over in 1830, they came over as miners. They were actually physically miners in Wales. So when they came over, they expected to be miners. They didn't come over to be entrepreneurs. They were expecting to be miners. And so in the beginning, they all came over about 1828, 1830, in that time frame. And they landed in Philadelphia and came up to Schuylkill County by way of the Schuylkill Canal. And then they stopped off in Minersville. There were two brothers, actually there were three brothers, but the third brother, Thomas, really didn't get as involved with the mining industry as his two brothers, Richard and William. And they kept naming the kids the same names. You have to know which generation. Drives me nuts. But anyway, Richard is the father, and he came with his sons, and they operated Little Diamond Colliery until 1835. I've got mine maps here, which are not easy to read, but Dave Williams helped me find some of the mines because they are close by Minersville. They also, after, when Richard, the father, died in 1836, the two brothers, William and Richard, carried on the Little Orchard Colliery until 1847, and at that point, William began operating the Peach Orchard Colliery. I don't know where these places are, but anyway, they're out there somewhere. And William ended up selling coal retail in Minersville. The estimated deed for the house, and we'll get to that, was about 1835, and that's 418 Front Street. Then Richard Sr. died, and he's buried in the Methodist Cemetery, and I'll show you his tombstone. The water company was 1855, and William became overseer for his brother Richard's colliery at Wolf Creek, because Richard died, he never married. So everything, all of this, the goods that he built up ended up going to William and William's children, and we'll get to that. Then First National Bank was 1864. Richard Kear was its first president, and then Charles R. was president in 1893. This is Richard Sr., came as a miner, lived in Minersville until he died in 1836. His sons continued the mining business after their father's death, and these were the mines that they were involved with. Little Diamond, Little Orchard on Oak Hill, and then Peach Orchard. And when I asked Dave Williams where they were, he said they're kind of, if you look at the mine map, they're kind of little places on the mine map, and it's hard to find them sometimes. But in 1856, William became overseer for his brother Richard's mine in Wolf Creek, which is the same Wolf Creek that we know off of 61. And William continued that position until 1860 when he retired. This is Richard Jr.'s tombstone. He died in 1864. I have his engraved announcement of his funeral, which I thought was really interesting. It was in the house. It was an invitation to the funeral, 1864. Realizing this is in the middle of the Civil War. And I'm just surprised that all of this was happening during this upheaval in the country. So William and William's children were the beneficiaries of the estate. And here's the house. This is the original Kear home, 1835. And according to the records, it was built in Norwegian Township, which I thought was very interesting, because when we were trying to find the deed, I was looking at Minersville thinking it was here, but it wasn't. It was deeded in Norwegian Township. And then William Kear married Elizabeth Gregg Kear. Keep those two names together because that's important. They had 8 children, one of whom died early, and the other ones survived. There's William G., he's important. Margaret married Stephen Dando, and I'm named after her. Richard C., he ended up going to Salina, Kansas, and dying in Salina. He drowned. He didn't come back. Edward G., I don't have a lot of information on him. Charles R. was my great-grandfather. Harrison A. inherited the house, and Frank Gregg was the baby. What's really neat about this, and you can't read it, but it's the death announcement. It's William's obituary, and it reads so interesting because they have the time he died. This was in the family Bible, and he had been confined to his home for the past winter and suffered greatly, which probably did. His main trouble was Bright's disease, which is a kidney failure, and that can be very painful, I'm sure, and that brought on his death. But here's the obituary. The deceased was in his 83rd year. Now this is Richard, the father's son, William. He was born in Pontypool, South Wales, came to America 60 years ago, located in Minersville. At that time, our town was but a wilderness, which I thought was interesting, with but a few common houses belonging to the first settlers scattered over its border. Mr. Kear was by occupation a miner, having entered the mines of Wales when he was a mere lad. At the age of 15, he had advanced to the position of breaker boss, and when he came to this country, he continued to pursue mining, an industry that was then in its infancy in this region. At that time, the coal was hauled in cars drawn by mules to Schuylkill Haven, and then the coal was put on the barges and went down the Schuylkill Canal. Mr. Kear continued to engage in coal mining as a miner, superintendent, and operator until some years ago when he retired from active business after accumulating, I love this, by energy, industry, and integrity, a goodly share of this world's goods. Mr. Kear was an exemplary Christian man, kind, loving, and charitable. The first church services were ever held in Minersville were held in his house. He organized the first Sunday school and for years had been the treasurer and mainstay of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Those services were in the living room of our house. And when my father's cousin died, Madge, I remember when she was laid out in the living room right in front of the fireplace, and I was 4. And I remember that distinctly because it was unique. The church will miss him. A family is bereft of a dear parent. The poor loses a friend who never failed to respond to their needs. And the community in general mourns the loss of one of its oldest and best loved citizens. And I thought that was a neat obituary. And so here's the end. Mr. Kear's wife, Elizabeth Gregg Kear, survives him. And it should be and do his children, but it says does. William Kear, Edward, Charles R., Frank, Harrison, Margaret Dando, and Richard C. Kear of Salinas, Kansas. The funeral takes place on Monday at 2 o'clock. And then here's the funeral announcement, and it says that there were Mr. Kear was for many years one of the most prominent and useful citizens, interesting adjective, of our neighboring borough, whose usefulness was only impaired by the feebleness that accompanies advancing age and declining years. He was bank president, furnace proprietor, and in fact his name and means were coupled with all the enterprises of the town. He was a man who walked upright, was always a friend to those who needed friends, and will be greatly missed. I mean, this was really neat to see this in the Bible. This is his tombstone in the Union Cemetery. And his wife survived him until 1895. So we'll get to Elizabeth Gregg. So here are the children. William and Elizabeth, they had 10 children, 8 of whom reached adulthood. William G. is the one you have to remember because he did a lot of stuff. Margaret, I want you to remember that one. Richard and Edward were not involved in the family businesses, but Charles R. Harrison and Frank G. were. Here we go, William G. This was the grandson of Richard. And I'm only doing 3 generations because I'm the 5th. And I didn't want to get everybody confused because they keep naming the children the same names. William G. was born in South Wales, came to Minersville with his mother, Elizabeth Gregg, when he was very young. He had to have been a toddler. It was stated in one source he had a very meager education, and at age 9, he was picking slate at a coal breaker. He did that until he was 17. So he really didn't get a long time in school. At some point, he survived his early experiences to build, along with his wife, Sarah Borda, a house on Kear's Hill, and I have a picture of that coming up, at 117 Spruce Street, which is now New Minersville, but is identified in the 1889 engraving of Minersville as the William Kear Sr. estate. And here's the map. Now, I have it up here, but what's interesting is to see which buildings you can identify. This is the estate, William Kear Estate, Kear's Hill. He had a farm, and so at one point they sold off those lots, part of the real estate. This is, one of these is 3rd Street School Building, and our house is, oh good, thank you, that helps me. Where's Front Street? This is, should you be able to find it? Mary Beth, can you see it?
No.
No. Is that, I think that may be it. No, that's it, right there, that's Front Street. 418 Front Street. But 1889, the 2nd Street School Building is still there. And William Kear's siblings went to school there. My great-grandfather went to school there. My father went to school there. My grandfather went to school there. I went to school there. So and then the building got turned down after I graduated from high school. Okay, here's William G. As an adult, he had to have been very enterprising. He apprenticed to a blacksmith until 1853, because he was born in 1830. When he was 23, he went to California and worked in a company that manufactured fireproof building equipment until 1856. He came back to Minersville, became a butcher until becoming an outside foreman for his uncle. This is Richard Jr., his father's brother, the one who had no children, at the Mine Hill Gap Colliery. And the Mine Hill Gap Colliery is important for us because our water, eventually I'll get to that, but our water supply comes into Minersville as a result of that Mine Hill Gap Colliery. In 1860, William G. began shipping coal out of Squiggle Haven, resumed being the outside foreman until 1864 when his uncle died, Richard Jr. At that point, he affiliated with his sister. This is when it gets really interesting, because they brought in their sister, but there were all these sons, brothers, if you will. So with Margaret Kear Dando and Charles R., Edward Harrison, and Richard C., they formed Kear Brothers and Company. That organization controlled Mine Hill Gap Colliery until it was sold to the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company in 1872. At that point, William G. helped in forming the Minersville Coal and Iron Company, with which he was involved until 1880. Simultaneously, he was involved in the mercantile business until 1888 when he retired, and then he managed his other interests, because he was the one that was up on Spruce Street and had the farm, and he divided those into building lots and sold those for residences. And my father's uncle, Charles F. Kear, he was in real estate. And I remember that he was still selling some of those lots. They sold for $25 a piece up in New Minersville. But anyway, I thought that was an interesting thing, that it wasn't that, they weren't that expensive, but they weren't all very big either. William G. was president of First National until he resigned in 1877. Jacob Lawrence succeeded him. I don't know if there's a connection with the Civil War Lawrence. I think that there probably is, it's just that I don't know what the connection is. And then Charles R. succeeded Mr. Lawrence as president of First National in 1887. William G. died in 1906. Harrison, his brother, was the trustee of the estate. I have the documents, which is interesting, because it showed how all of that money was dispersed and given out to the siblings. And they date from 1906 to 1913, and the ending balance of the estate was $792.94 as of May 1913. He and Sarah Border had 8 children, but only 2 lived, and they were both girls, Bertha and Mary. And speaking of Mary, the men married Marys, so they were Mary Kear. The men had children, they named them Mary Kear, and it's trying to find those people. I have no idea which Mary Kear they were. Anyway, here's Kear Brothers and Company. It's on 3rd and Sunbury Streets. I'm sure you recognize the building. And it was most likely constructed by William C. Kear, or G. Kear, excuse me, William G. First floor housed the Kear Brothers and Company, and the second floor was the Opera House. Here's the First National Bank. It was incorporated in 1863 under the national banking system with a capital of $50,000. First directors, Richard Kear, Samuel Kaufman, Jacob Wist, Jacob Lawrence, John Weitzman, John Monhan, and John Wadlinger. Presidents of this bank have been in succession: Richard Kear, Jacob Lawrence, William Kear, Jacob Lawrence, and then he's the president. And this was written, I think, in the 1800s. The first cashier was Samuel Kaufman, who was succeeded by the present cashier, Robert Potter. And the banking house, which is owned by the bank, is on the corner of Sunbury and 3rd, South 3rd. Okay, recognize this building? This was built by Margaret Kear Dando and Stephen Dando. They were married in 1852, and they lived in this home and had 6 children, 2 of whom lived to adulthood. So kids died a lot. Jenny married a Mr. Straub, and I can't find out which Straub that was. And Mary married Charles Steele, and it's spelled in 2 different ways. But they included Margaret in the business activities, which I thought was interesting. Then, this is my great-grandfather. He was also involved in the community. He had a better education than his brother. He attended Dickinson Seminary in Williamsport. He was born in 1846, grew up in that house in which I live. attended the Second Street School and graduated from the seminary. He was also part of the 3-month enlistment in the Union Army and was discharged in 1863 in the middle of the war. He was involved in Mine Hill Gap as a shipper until it was sold to the Philadelphia and Reading Coal and Iron Company, and he became a partner of Kear Brothers in 1864. He was director of First National Bank, and he served as president. He was instrumental in building the Minersville Water Company, and was the principal stockholder and superintendent in 1883. He was involved in the Minersville Coal and Iron, served on its board of directors, investor in the Minersville Building and Loan Association, was director and treasurer, and he served on borough council. Don't you wonder when they had time for all of this? I don't know. Okay, this is my direct family. This is my grandfather. This is my great-grandfather, and all of these people. They had 8 children, 7 sons and 1 daughter. This is why the Kear families. You've got to follow the men. The back row is Robert, and there's George, and that's William, and that's Albert, and this is Conrad. Josephine Seltzer Kear, from the Seltzer family in Seltzer City. This is Mary, the only girl. Spoiled? Who, me? No. Beautiful look. This is Charles R. This is Charles F. And this is Frank. They had so many Franks, and I can't tell the difference sometimes between some of the sons that were Francis, and they changed it to Frank, or which generation is the Frank, because this is, Charles R. had a brother, Frank, and the brother, Frank, named his son Frank. So, the different middle initials, I think that was the only thing. This was their home, Charles R. and Josephine Seltzer's home, former American Legion, built in the early years of the 20th century. He died in 1917, she followed in 1918. The son, when they died, the son-in-law inherited the house, the man who was married to Mary. And he was a dentist, and he sold the building and then died in 1932. As a dentist, he had access to drugs, gas. He died of an overdose. He gassed himself to death, which was, there's a picture of him, and you can tell he's depressed. Anyway, I came across this because this is a card of Josephine Seltzer and Charles R. They sent it to my dad when, in 1912, Dad would have been, he was born in December of '04, so he was 7, and it says, "Hurry up and get well of those measles to be a man, and then you work hard, and then you won't have any more measles. Only 2 little ones, trouble worse than measles from your grandmom and pop." And it was sent to, they didn't need to have addresses in 1912, just Minersville, PA, and Schuylkill County. This is the water company business, and it was organized in 1856, but the water came in 1861, brought in from Big Run or Dyer's Run. That's still where we get our water, still from the big dam on Broad Mountain, 4 miles north from the borough, in pipes which pass through Mine Hill Gap. The dam from which the pipes are supplied is 470 feet higher than the lowest point in the borough, giving a pressure sufficient to throw 1 1/4 inch stream to a height of 120 feet. Of course, obviating all necessity for fire engines, which I thought was a really interesting point. Pipes are laid through all the principal streets of the borough, which is thus supplied with water of purity not excelled. The engineer under whom the work was laid out was Samuel Lewis. Okay, you recognize Dennicola's house? It was Dr. Straub's house when this house was built. This was my grandparents' home, and Dr. Pickett's office, because my grandfather built it in conjunction with his sister, Mary. And the water company office was right here, in the first room of that building at 24 Sunbury Street. And so that was the water company office from 1912 until 1937. And there's the water company office building now. It was built in 1937. Uncle Harrison, always called him Uncle Harrison. He wasn't my uncle, he was my grandfather's uncle. Anyway, he was heavily involved in the community, educated in the Minersville school system, graduated from Dickinson Seminary in Williamsport, began work as a teller in the First National Bank. Notice how they take care of family. I was fascinated by how they managed to get together and work together to take care of the family. He was appointed Deputy Collector of Internal Revenue for the 15th Division of the 1st District, which comprised Schuylkill County. So he was a tax collector. He joined several fraternal organizations, such as the International Order of Odd Fellows, and I'll have a picture of that, and was director of First National Bank. Served 27 years on the school board. Has his name in marble in the former Minersville High School, now the Minersville Elementary School, and was presented with a silver token of appreciation by the pupils and teachers for his years of service, and that's right there. I thought that was interesting. We kept some of this stuff in the house. And the reason I'm going through all of this stuff is that my children have said, Mom, you've got to get out of that house. So I'm moving to Seattle in 2020, and I'm trying to figure out what kind of information can I glean from all of the paperwork that's still in the house. Harrison remained in the house at 418 Front Street as caregiver, along with his wife, to his mother, Elizabeth Gregg Kear, after his father died. She didn't die until 1895, and there is I haven't found the document, but I know I've seen it, a document that says that the siblings agreed to give Harrison the house if he stayed there and took care of his mother, which he did. And so Harrison and Annie Scott Kear, his wife, had 4 children. Libby and Robbie are buried in the Union Cemetery, and because they died, they were both 3 years old when they died. And Madge, Margaret Dando Kear, and Wally, see how they get to these names? Margaret Kear Dando, Margaret Dando Kear, drives me nuts. And Wally was Harrison Walton Kear. They lived to adulthood. But the adult family members are all buried in Baber, and they all 4 died within 8 years of each other, between 1831 and 1839. Or, excuse me, 1931, 1939. And there's Libby and Robbie in the Union. Now, this is the baby. Frank G. Kear remained in Minersville after completing his education, graduated from Dickinson Seminary, attended the Polytechnic Institute in Philadelphia, where he took classes in mining and civil engineering. Frank started a brewery around 1879 until 1883. He was also involved in the Minersville Coal and Iron Company, First National Bank, Minersville Water Company, director and president of the Minersville Fire Insurance Company, owner and manager of the Mountaineer Opera House, and served on the Borough Council. And the Minersville, the only opera house I know of is that one that was William Kear, or Kear Brothers. Frank married twice. Both wives were named Kate. Lovely. Trying to figure that one out. Hanich is spelled in 2 different ways, H-A-N-I-C-H and H-O-E-N-I-C-H. And then his second wife was Kate Snyder. Kate Hanich died at 31 after having 3 children, but only 1 survived. And then there were 2 children from his second marriage, Helen and Frank G. A note in the Republican Herald in December of 2016 stated, when you read those little from 100 years ago, 75 years ago, 50 years ago, this was from 100 years ago, Miss Helen Kear of Minersville celebrated her 20th birthday by entertaining her friends at a dinner. One of her gifts was 20 beautiful pink rosebuds from her father. I thought that was really neat. Because there was a greenhouse in the back of this, of Frank G. Kear's house, and it was all glass, and you had to go up steps, and there was water and everything, and I remember being in there when I was between 5 and 10, and then it started to fall apart. But the greenhouse was in the back of his house, where those rosebuds could have been homegrown. I'm not sure about that, but it sounds like it might have been. A second child, Frank G., my great-grandfather's nephew, was only a year older than my father, Carl. And again, this generation is not one of the ones I'm dealing with in this presentation. Yeah. Okay, I've done that. There we are with the Opera House, and Frank G. Kear was owner and manager. And I'm assuming that this is the Mountaineer Opera House on that second floor. That used to be the theater. Okay, buildings. The International Order of Oddfellows, it was built in 1852, you can see that there. And this is the group of people, the men, that I think were celebrating their 50th year of existence. And I have a big photograph up there with the names of the different people, and there were a lot of Kears in that photograph. There they are. There was, does anybody remember Harvey's drugstore?
Yeah.
Okay. Wasn't that John Harvey? I think so, but I'm not sure. This is my dad's Uncle Charlie, and this is Mr. Potter at the bank. And I remember Dad talking about Mr. Potter. He lived on Carbon Street. And then the middle row, this is Conrad Kear. And then there is Frank G. Kear right there. And this is Uncle, well, that's Frank G. No, that is Uncle Harrison. And that's Johnny Bowman. Johnny Bowman was my grandmother's uncle. And then the first row here is Dr. James Pickett, which he does look depressed. And then George Ball, do you remember Ball Lumber?
Sure.
Okay. And Ira Jones, do you remember the Free Press?
Yes.
Okay. And then William Kear is this one, and that's my grandfather, Albert. So I don't know all of these. William Heckman, I think, is Heckman's grocery store, but I'm not sure because I didn't track some of these people. This is a house that was built by the daughter of Margaret Dando, or Kear Dando, and her husband, Stephen. That was Mary. Here's another Mary. Mary Dando married Charlie Steele, and they built this house on Front and Carbon. There was a ballroom on that second floor, and they had doorknobs of silver, which was told to me by another source. And they had one daughter, Marjorie Steele, and she married Isidore Stella, and they're all buried in Baber Cemetery. This was Marjorie Steele, who married Isidore Stella. They had one son, Allison, and I bet you remember Allison, right? Somebody remembers Allison, because he was only a couple years older than I am. Stooks? Jimmy? You're not sure? Anyway, Marjorie was the granddaughter of Mark Kear Dando, and her mother was Mary Dando Steele. Now, here we go. We're back to the house of the Margaret Kear Dando and Stephen Dando. The house was the residence of the Broom sisters. We had a discussion on G. Frank Broom. Miss Sue and Miss Joe lived there until moving to Market Street in Pottsville in the 50s. The building is now part of St. Nicholas Ukrainian Catholic School and the residence of the surviving sisters who serve St. Nicholas Church. And there's Miss Sue and Miss Joe and Madge. They were close friends, and the sisters were daughters of Charles Napoleon and Virginia James Broome. Their brother Seth was a doctor in Philadelphia, and Madge was one of his patients because she would go down for ophthalmology appointments. And my father would drive her to the appointments. And at some point in August 1939, Madge changed her will. She had originally willed it to a cousin that was in Phoenixville, somewhere around there. She died in 1939, and that's when my parents inherited the house. The house. There it is. It's 183 years old. And that's it.
Very good.
No. I hope I didn't bore you. Do you have questions? Because there's lots of stuff here. Feel free to look at the documents and the photographs. If you have questions, please feel free to ask.
Was Mary Dando any relation to the Dandos in Gordon? Do you know?
I asked that question because there had been a Dando who was a principal or something at the school, and he said, "Oh, I'm really not interested in genealogy." And I said, "Okay, what do you do with that?" Because I did ask, and he said, "Well, you'd have to ask my sister." Well, I didn't know who his sister was. Yeah.
William Dando, his
Yeah.
name is.
Well, the same thing is true of Lipset.